My name is John. Sit down. What I'm about to tell you actually happened. The man was moving wrong. That was the first thing. Not wrong in the way that a drunk man moves, or a frightened man, or a man lost in the dark looking for a latrine at 3 a.m, all of which Stubby had seen, all of which he had learned to read with the fluency of an animal that had spent 18 months in the company of soldiers and had internalized at a level below anything you could call training. The entire vocabulary of how men move when they are comfortable and how they move when they are not. This man was moving wrong in a different way. Careful wrong, deliberate wrong. The specific, controlled slowness of someone who very much does not want to be heard. The trench was dark, and the night was the particular black of a French autumn without moon, and the sector of Saint-Michel had been quiet enough for 3 hours that some of the men had actually managed to sleep, which was the only reason. The sound reached Stubby at all because in the normal noise of an active trench line, with its coughing and muttering and the distant percussion of artillery that had become, after enough months, simply the ambient sound of this world. The faint scraping of a boot on wet earth 30 meters outside the wire would have been swallowed whole, but the trench was quiet, and Stubby heard it. And every hair on his square, scarred body stood up in the particular way they stood up when the thing he was detecting was not a rat, not a stray cat, not one of his own men coming back late from a listening post, but something that belonged to the category his nervous system had learned over 17 battles and 4 major offensives to classify as enemy. He did not bark, not yet. He moved toward the wire in silence, low and fast, because he had also learned, and this is the part that the men who served with him still struggled to explain decades later, that there are moments when making noise is the right response, and moments when moving first and making noise second is better, and that the difference between those moments is something you feel before you can articulate it. He felt it now. He went through the gap in the wire that he knew was there because he had been through it before, and he found the man in the dark, and he hit him at the back of the knee with the full force of a compact, muscular body that had been running across broken terrain since before he could remember, and the man went down, and Stubby bit into the fabric of his trousers and held, and the man struggled, and Stubby held, and the noise of the struggle woke the soldiers in the nearest section of trench, and the soldiers came, and they found a German cartographer face down in the mud of no man's land with a partially completed map of American positions in his hand, and a stout, battle-scarred dog attached to the back of his leg who showed absolutely no intention of letting go until someone he weighed perhaps 14 pounds. And on weighed perhaps 14 pounds. And on that night in 1918, he captured an enemy spy with his teeth and his instincts, and 18 months of accumulated tactical intelligence, and became the only dog in the history of the United States Army ever to be promoted to sergeant on the basis of action in the field. This is how it started. Go back to 1917. Go back to New Haven, Connecticut, to the campus of Yale University, which had been temporarily converted into a training ground for the men of the 102nd Infantry Regiment, 26th Division, a division that would become known as the Yankee Division, built almost entirely from New England National Guard units, young men from Massachusetts and Connecticut and Vermont, who had been drilling on this campus for weeks in the particular atmosphere of barely organized chaos that attends the transformation of civilians into soldiers. They had their rifles and their packs and their drill sergeants and the specific quality of exhaustion that comes from physical training combined with the permanent low-level anxiety of men who know they are being prepared for something enormous and are not yet sure they are ready for it. And somewhere in the margins of all this in the gaps between formations, in the edges of the drill fields, in the places where the official machinery of military preparation had not quite extended its reach. There was a dog, small, barrel-chested, head too large for the body in the endearing way of certain breeds, with a stub of a tail that moved with the perpetual enthusiasm of an animal that had decided, apparently at birth, that the world was fundamentally a good and interesting place and that most of the humans in it were worth knowing. He had appeared from nowhere in the way that dogs appear in places where young men are gathered in large numbers, drawn by the food and the noise and the particular emotional warmth that emanates from a group of people who are simultaneously trying to be tough and quietly terrified, and who therefore have enormous reserves of undeployed tenderness available to the right animal at the right moment. He had no name when he arrived. He had no collar, no tags, no history that anyone could trace. He had apparently no owner and no fixed address and no particular plan beyond the immediate one of attaching himself to the most promising available human and seeing what happened next. The human he chose was Robert Conroy. Private Robert Conroy, 20 years old, from New Haven, recently inducted, currently in the process of learning to be a soldier with the 102nd Infantry. The choice, if you want to call it that, appears to have been mutual. Conroy found the dog, or the dog found Conroy, and within a very short period, the arrangement had solidified from provisional to permanent in the way that arrangements between young men and dogs tend to do, which is to say quickly and without much explicit negotiation. Conroy named him Stubby for the tail. The tail seemed to find this acceptable. The training continued, and Stubby, with the intuitive genius of a dog that understands on some level that its continued presence in a given situation depends on being useful rather than merely decorative, began to learn. He learned the bugle calls, not as abstract sounds, but as signals. He understood that this specific sequence of notes meant the men were about to move, and that one meant they were coming back, and that another meant something requiring attention. He learned the drill commands, or at least enough of them that he could anticipate the movements they produced and position himself accordingly. He learned to present himself in a way that resembled a military salute, front paw raised, head at a particular angle, which may have been trained or may have been an organic development from watching the men around him respond to officers. Depending on which account you read and how much anthropomorphism you are comfortable with. Either way, it worked. It would save his life, in a manner of speaking, several months later on a very cold boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The orders came in the autumn of 1917. The 102nd Infantry was shipping out. The men packed their equipment and said whatever goodbyes they could arrange and made their way to the transport that would carry them to France and the war. Stubby was not on the manifest. Stubby was not in any official document pertaining to the deployment of the 102nd Infantry Regiment. Stubby was, from the perspective of the United States Army, a dog that did not exist in any operational capacity. Robert Conroy understood this perfectly. He also understood, with the clarity of a 20-year-old who has decided that he is not going to France without his dog, that the problem of non-existence in official documents is a logistical problem and not a moral one, and that logistical problems have solutions if you are creative enough to find them. He wrapped Stubby in his greatcoat and carried him up the gangway. He found, in the hold of the troop transport, a section of coal stores that was dark and warm and accessible to a determined man with a small dog, and that is where Stubby spent the crossing. In the dark, in the coal dust, fed by Conroy from his own rations, invisible to the army that did not know he existed. It could not last, of course. Discoveries of this kind never last on a ship, where the number of places to hide is finite, and the time of the voyage is long. An officer found them. The officer looked at the dog. The dog looked at the officer. And then, according to every account that has survived this moment, Stubby raised his right paw. The salute. Whether trained or spontaneous, it was perfectly timed, and its effect on the officer was apparently decisive. He did not order the dog removed. He told Conroy to keep it out of his sight for the rest of the crossing. Stubby arrived in France. The army did not know he was there. This would change. The sector they were assigned to was the Chemin des Dames in February of 1918, and the Chemin des Dames in February of 1918 was one of the more comprehensively miserable places on the surface of the earth. The Western Front had been static for years at this point. Years of artillery exchanges and infantry assaults and gas attacks and the grinding mutual destruction of two industrial military machines pointed at each other across a strip of devastated ground that neither side could cross without catastrophic loss. The trenches were deep and wet and cold. The mud was of a specific and legendary quality, not the mud of a country road after rain, but the consolidated product of years of shelling and drainage failure, and the particular chemistry of disturbed chalk and clay that created a substance with the texture and adhesive properties of wet concrete that pulled at boots and swallowed equipment and had, on documented occasions, swallowed men. The rats were large and unafraid and present in numbers that the soldiers had stopped trying to count because counting them made it worse. The cold came up from the ground through the duck boards and through the boots and through the socks and lodged in the feet and stayed there, and over all of it. The constant awareness that the enemy was close, sometimes 30 meters away, sometimes less, separated from you by nothing except the specific strip of churned, wire-tangled ground that both sides had been trying and failing to cross for 4 years. Stubby went into the trenches with the 102nd. This was not a decision anyone made in the formal sense. It was simply what happened. Because Conroy was in the trenches and Stubby was with Conroy, and the logic of that attachment had already proven itself stronger than the logic of military regulations. The men accepted him immediately and completely, the way soldiers in terrible situations accept anything warm and alive and indifferent to rank. He slept in the dugouts. He ate what the men ate, which in the trenches of 1918 was primarily tinned. Corned beef and hardtack and whatever could be scrounged from the field kitchens, when the field kitchens were functional, which was not always. He moved through the trench system with the low, confident ease of an animal that has decided this is its territory, navigating the duck boards and the fire steps and the narrow connective passages between sections with a sureness of foot that the men, slipping and cursing in their heavy boots, found genuinely enviable. And he began almost immediately to be useful in ways that no one had anticipated and no training program had produced. The gas attacks were the first test. Mustard gas and phosgene and chlorine. The chemical weapons of the Great War were delivered by artillery shell or by wind-driven cloud, and their arrival was not always preceded by warning enough for the men to get their masks on in time. The detection systems available to the Allied forces in 1918 were primitive by any standard. Sentries watching for the yellow-green tinge in the air that preceded a chlorine release, listening for the particular sound of a gas shell versus a high-explosive shell, depending on smell and sight and hearing to identify something that could kill a man before he could fully register that it was there. Stubby had been caught once by a gas attack early in his time at the front, before anyone had thought to provide him with a mask. The attack was a mustard gas release, and the effects on his respiratory system and the membranes of his face were severe enough to require treatment and recovery time. They were also, it became apparent over the following weeks, transformative in a way that nobody had predicted. The chemical burn had sensitized the olfactory receptors in his nose to a degree that turned an already acute sense of smell into something that operated at a different order of magnitude from what it had been before. He could smell gas. Not just smell it when it was already present in lethal concentration. Smell it when it was approaching, when the concentration was still far below the threshold at which any human nose, however attentive, could detect it. He could smell it far enough away that he had time to move through the trench, barking and biting, pulling at blankets and shaking sleeping men by their sleeves before the cloud arrived. He saved the regiment, not once, repeatedly. There are documented accounts of gas alerts triggered by Stubby that gave the men of the 100-second, the 30 seconds, or the 60 seconds, that is the entire difference between getting a mask on in time and not getting a mask on in time. 30 seconds. The difference between those two outcomes, measured in lung tissue and eyesight and life, is not a small thing. He found the wounded. This is the part of Stubby's service record that, when you sit with it, becomes one of the most remarkable things about him. The tactical logic of it is straightforward enough to describe. In the chaos of an infantry engagement, men were wounded in no man's land, in the spaces between the wire and the forward positions, in places where the fire was too heavy for stretcher bearers to move, and where a wounded man lying in the dark might bleed out before anyone knew he was there. Stubby could hear them. This requires a moment of attention, because the battlefield of the Western Front was not a quiet place in which subtle sounds could be easily distinguished. It was a landscape of continuous, overlapping, world-filling noise. The artillery, the small arms fire, the explosions, the shouts of men, the machinery of a war being fought at industrial scale. In this noise, the sound of a man whimpering in pain, an engagement and move through no man's an engagement, and move through no man's land, which was, by clinical definition, one of the most dangerous pieces of ground on earth. Listening, finding the English-speaking wounded, staying with them, licking their faces and lying against them for warmth, and barking to direct the stretcher bearers. Men who were alive when the stretcher bearers arrived, who would not have been alive if they had lain in the cold and the dark for another 2 hours, came home after the war and named a dog as part of the reason. Some of them never stopped talking about it. Some of them never talked about it at all, in the way that people sometimes cannot find the words for the things they owe the most. If you have never heard this story before, I want you to stop for a moment, because what I just described, a dog moving alone through no man's land to find the wounded, is not something from a novel. It is in the official record. It is in the after-action reports and the letters home and the testimony of men who saw it happen. Leave a comment if this is the first time you are hearing about Stubby, because I suspect many of you are, and that fact says something about the history we choose to remember and the history we let slip. The institutional response to Stubby was, in its way, one of the more interesting things about this story. Military organizations are not, by their nature, flexible about what belongs in a combat unit and what does not. Dogs were not in the table of organization for an infantry regiment in the American Expeditionary Forces. They had no official status, no supply allocation, no veterinary provision in the formal sense. And yet Stubby persisted in the 102nd, not despite the institutional resistance, but through a combination of Conroy's protective determination and the increasingly impossible to ignore evidence of what Stubby was actually contributing to the unit's operational effectiveness. The commanding officers of the 102nd were not sentimental men. They were professional soldiers managing a complex tactical situation in a difficult theater. And they kept Stubby because Stubby was operationally useful. And the evidence for his utility was written in gas alerts, raised in time, and wounded men found alive in a perimeter security function that operated 24 hours a day without relief, without complaint, and without pay. The bureaucratic question of what exactly Stubby was from a regulatory standpoint was resolved in the way that these questions are often resolved at the unit level by simply not asking it very loudly. He was wounded. Of course he was wounded. 17 battles in 18 months on the Western Front, and the Western Front in 1918 was not a place where sustained participation produced uninjured participants. A German hand grenade fragment caught him in the foreleg during an engagement in the tool sector, a wound serious enough that the regiment's medical staff had to improvise treatment using the supplies and skills they had. He recovered. He went back. This is worth noting because it is not the obvious outcome. A wounded animal in a combat zone in 1918, without dedicated veterinary support, might reasonably be expected to be taken out of the line and not returned to it. Stubby was returned to the line because the men wanted him there and because he wanted to be there, and the distinction between those two facts is one that anyone who has spent time with dogs will recognize immediately, and anyone who has not will find difficult to fully explain. The women of Chateau Thierry sewed him a coat. This is one of those details that sounds invented and is entirely real. When the 26th Division passed through the town after the fighting there, the civilian population, particularly the women of the town who had lived through the German occupation and the fighting and had their own relationship with what it cost to resist and what it cost to survive, recognized Stubby as something that deserved honoring, and they honored him in the way available to them, which was the way of people who work with their hands. They made him a chamois leather coat, cut to fit his specific dimensions, with the proper fastenings to hold it on through mud and movement. And on this coat, as his service record accumulated, his medals and citations were pinned: the wound stripe, the various unit citations, the acknowledgments of specific actions. He wore this coat for official occasions with the gravity of an animal that understood, in whatever way, animals understand ceremony, that the coat meant something, and that the something it meant was worth being still for. Now we arrive at Saint-Mihiel, and at the night that made him a sergeant. September 1918. The American offensive at Saint-Mihiel was one of the first large-scale independent operations by the American Expeditionary Forces, the first time the Americans had fought as a unified army rather than as components fed into French and British formations. For the men of the 102nd Infantry, this meant a level of operational intensity that exceeded even the demanding standard of the previous months. The lines were active, the enemy was alert, and the particular tension of a sector about to become the axis of a major offensive produced a quality of watchfulness in everyone present, human and otherwise. It was in this context, on a night when the trench was quiet enough that Stubby could hear what he heard, that the German cartographer made his mistake of moving wrong. He moved too slowly, too deliberately, with the specific controlled tension of a man performing a covert task in the immediate proximity of people who would shoot him on sight if they heard him. And in the dark, on the far side of the wire, in the silence between the artillery rounds, Stubby heard the boots on wet ground and every instinct in his body that 18 months of war had sharpened into something extraordinary, identified what it was before his conscious processing. If dogs have conscious processing in the relevant sense, could have formulated the question. He went through the wire gap. He found the man. He hit him low and hard and bit through the trouser fabric and held. The man went down and struggled and could not dislodge 14 pounds of dog that had decided this was not a situation that ended until Stubby decided it ended. The noise brought the soldiers. The soldiers found the map. The map showed American positions the Germans had been observing and recording, information that, in the hands of German artillery or German command, would have cost lives in the upcoming offensive. The capture was real. The intelligence value was real. The Army sat down and figured out how to promote a dog to sergeant. And it turned out that this was possible if you were determined enough about it, which they were. His service ended with the war in November 1918, and what happened to him afterward is a coda that says as much about what he was as anything that happened in France. He came home famous. The story had spread through newspapers and word of mouth and the letters of returning veterans, and the American public in 1919 received Stubby with the enthusiasm of people who needed heroes in a form they could understand and love without complication. He led parades, dozens of them in cities across the country, riding in cars decorated with bunting, wearing his coat with its medals, receiving the attention of crowds with the equanimity of an animal that has been through things that make crowds seem manageable. He met Woodrow Wilson, who shook his paw. He met Warren Harding. He met Calvin Coolidge, 3 presidents who recognized a sergeant of the United States Army and treated him accordingly. He went to Georgetown University Law School with Conroy and became the mascot there, attending football games and dormitory life with the same quality of complete presence that had defined his time in the trenches. He died in 1926 in Conroy's arms, with the particular timing of old dogs who wait until the right person is holding them. He was perhaps 10 years old. He had 17 battles, 4 major offensives, 1 confirmed enemy capture, and 3 presidents behind him, and a coat full of medals that the Smithsonian Institution decided were worth keeping indefinitely, which is the institution's way of saying that what those medals represent is too important to let go. You can see him today in Washington. He is smaller than you expect, behind the glass, in the coat that the women of Chateau Thierry made for him. The medals are still there. The wound stripe, the campaign ribbons, the unit citations of the 102nd Infantry, the Yankee Division, the men who went to France and came back and spent the rest of their lives telling anyone who would listen about the dog who went with them. Here is what Stubby was, stated as simply as I can state it. He was an animal that found a situation, assessed it with the tools available to him, and gave everything those tools could produce. He was not asked to be a gas detector or a wound finder or a spy catcher. He became those things because the situation required them, and he was the one present who could provide them. The men of the 102nd did not manufacture his contributions to their survival. They received them and were grateful and brought him home and shook the hands of 3 presidents with him and buried him in 1926 with the grief of people who understand that they have lost something they cannot replace and will spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. That grief is not sentimental. It is accurate. He was irreplaceable. He was a sergeant. He was one of the best soldiers the Yankee Division ever had. And if that seems like a large claim to make about a 14-pound dog with a stubtail who wandered onto a drill field in New Haven in 1917, I would simply ask you to measure the claim against the record. The record is there. It has been in the Smithsonian since 1956. It will be there after both of us are gone. And if this story is new to you, if you had never heard the name Stubby before today, leave a comment and tell me that, because you are not alone, and because the fact that this story is not known the way it should be known is something worth saying out loud. He earned better than obscurity. He earned exactly what the Yankee division gave him, which is everything they had, for as long as they had it to give. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. The stories are waiting. They always are.